Welcome everybody to another double feature. Today I have for you the Cold Assault Clone Trooper and a Clone Flame Trooper. I've been doing a lot of double showcases lately, mostly due to the thematic thread in the way I select what to make. For example, in the past I've grouped together the ARC Trooper Jesse and the Ahsoka Trooper, and the ATRT and the ATRT driver. But this video's pairing is more akin to the Commander Faye and Keller video I did, in which I showed the progression of one custom to the other. When I finish a project, I often feel this nagging sensation that I can improve on certain aspects. In this case, I first made the Cold Assault Trooper, and with what I've learned, I then went on to build the Flame Trooper. But first, let me touch a bit on the inspiration. For those who are familiar with the Clone Wars animation, you remember the Cold Assault Trooper from the Plutonia episodes, while the Flame Troopers appears in the famous second invasion of Geonosis with this special brown and yellow paint scheme. There is something very provocative about their designs. Perhaps it's because the costumes pay tribute to Ralph McQuarrie's original Snow Trooper concepts, or the quasi-World War aesthetic with the trench coat, helmet, and the neck cowl. But to be honest, the first time I see this design, I just immediately bring to mind a happy cartoon dog. I don't know if anybody else have the same image. But I digress. Let's get back to the showcase. Right off the bat, I must point out that despite the similar appearances, these two figures are completely different. And I must also say that the Clone Trooper is probably the most challenging customs I've done to date. It's laborious and have a healthy dose of uncertainty that threatens to derail the project. But before I go any further, I will give you all a couple of seconds to guess the difference between the two. For those of you who spotted the difference lies in the heads, you are absolutely correct. The Cold Assault Trooper head sculpt is made from resin, designed by Skylu's 3D and printed by the great John Walker Customs. It is a beautiful representation of what we have in the animated show. For the Flame Trooper, the head sculpt is fully articulated. I usually like to pose my figure in a neutral pose with the head slightly tilting down, so I experimented a bit and this is the result. It is essentially a kit bash with a John Walker head sculpt of the Republic Marine, a Bandai model kit Phase 1 head, and some leather scraps for the neck cowl. This results in a live-action interpretation of the Flame Trooper, if there is to be a live-action version, while the Cold Assault Clone Trooper has a look more faithful to the animated show. But first, let's take a closer look at the Cold Assault Trooper. The body is from a Hoth Snow Trooper figure, and I did some minor modifications to the shoulders to smooth out the notches. I also sanded down the head sculpt around the shoulders to make it sit lower on the body. But that aside, I left it pretty much the same, because while I can modify certain elements to make it more show accurate, such as the belt and the boots, I decided in the end, the payoff is not worth the risk and labor. I'm okay with slight inaccuracies as long as the main aspects are well represented. In my case, I wish to focus on the head sculpt, the pinstripes of the undercoat, and the backpack. And along this line, I want to repeat what I said many times in my past videos, is that when I make these customs, I want the figures to remain toyetic. Last thing I want is to make something so delicate with many add-on parts that the pieces will just crack and fall off just by breathing on it. So for the stripes, they're not difficult to pull off. It's just a very tedious process. I'll bring up the Flame Trooper to demonstrate. I first sprayed on the darker color, and once cured, I took thin strips of 0.7mm wide masking tape and place on the stripes while negotiating the folds of the sculpt. I then spray on the lighter color, and once that is cured, then I pull off the tape and voila, you end up with neat stripes. One thing to be mindful though is paint rub on the joints. In the beginning of the process, Once the figure is taken apart, I took the extra time to sand down the points of contact. There's nothing that bugs me more than paint rub, and I'm sure many of you will relate to this. To know which area to sand, you have to study the figure. In most cases, you don't have to worry too much about loose joints because the rigidity of the joints are actually created by these hidden protrusions, while there are these divots on the receiving end. With the pins in place, this will lock the joint in place and contribute to the click-clock effect that you have when you articulate the figure. As long as you don't disturb this mechanism, you should not have much problems with loose joints. So in this case, I'll sand along these parts. And here, just enough so that when painted, it won't wear each other's paints. And if you are actually very judicious in the way you apply your paints, meaning you don't just cake them on, you just spray them in thin layers and you give it enough time for it to cure, paint rub would not be that big of a problem. As for the backpack, there are no resin sculpts available in the market, so I got off my lazy ass and decided to scratch build it using plastic sheets. This for me is like going back to architecture school. I spent about 9 years doing architecture education, and yeah, it brings up some memories of it. The only things I could point out about this figure is that once the head is mounted, there isn't much to be had in terms of articulation. This is due to the rigidity of the resin, and even the Hasbro Snow Trooper and the Flame Trooper doesn't offer much movement. What's worst, my next project, being the Flame Trooper and its paint scheme, will require me to paint the chest armor no matter what. I can't escape it. So even if I manage to pull off some articulation with these hard material, you'll result in, you guessed it, more paint rub. So with this in mind, I have to consider some other options. I first thought maybe I could modify the Hasbro Gaming Grades Flame Trooper head and shove a Phase 1 Clone Trooper helmet in there. But in the end, the top portion of the helmet for the Flame Trooper is way too small. I then had the idea of taking the Republic Marine resin head sculpt from John Walker and grinding it down to only the helmet. I somehow miraculously pulled this off with all my fingers still intact. For the rest of the helmet, I built only the lower portion of the Bandai Model Kit Phase 1 helmet, with the side heavily grinded down. But here lies the challenge. How can I seamlessly attach leather to plastic? Fortunately, Bandai's plastic and leather glues very well using your normal model cement. This is the brand I use in case if anybody's curious. It is actually a Korean brand and it was recommended to me by the shop owner, and I have no problem ever since. It provides a very, very nice bond. I then used a masking sheet to mock up the soft goods portion and then came up with this pattern. Once glued, I dabbed the edges with crazy glue to prevent leather from fraying at the edges. And this also allows me to do some light sanding. Overall, I am super happy with the way this turned out. Even aesthetically, the live action take gives it a more menacing vibe. I originally wanted to indent the grill, for example, indent the grill around the mouth, but I opted to raise it instead. It's just easier to pull off. But quoting Bob Ross, this is actually a happy accident because it really reminds me of the Hannibal Lecter mask. And when one thinks of real-life Flame Trooper, it conjures up a nightmare-fueled image. I can imagine, for most people, being burnt alive is probably on the bottom of the list to perish. The top being death by euphoria, sleeping on top of a bed of marshmallows, and doing a bunch of stuff that I'm probably not able to say in this video. But yeah, the project had me thinking every step of the way, and it keeps on piling up challenges that forces me to reevaluate my plan. But in the end, it worked out. For those of you who would rather skip this nerve-wracking and laborious process, the John Walker head sculpt is actually very faithful representation to the show and will do just fine. It's very beautiful. But here I am, I'm actually a masochist, as I said many times, so this is the result of me punishing myself, and I hope that you guys actually enjoy watching the fruits of my torturing myself. But I think this trooper would look very nice to my shelf, considering the fact that I already have an ARF trooper with the same paint scheme, and most likely my next project will be the special ops version seen in the same show. So I hope you enjoy this, and I'll see you in the next video.